Okay, and lastly in this session, a former boxarian, Lucy Snowball, currently, well, Lucy will explain more, but she can, as you can see, there we go, Centre for Education Statistics and Evaluation. Lucy will be speaking about whether or not the National Firearms Agreement reduced the likelihood of a gun massacre in Australia. Over to Lucy, thanks.
Great, and thank you very much for sticking around after what I imagine has been a very long day for this talk. I might actually just shoot back, Paul, if that's okay, to the front page. I don't know if I can do that. I probably can't, that's okay. So I am from the New South Wales Department of Education, and I am going to be talking to you about the National Firearms Agreement. And there may be a slight question in your mind about why that is the case. And that's actually because this work that I'm talking about today was work I did outside of my job. It was work that I did as part of a master's thesis with Dr. Jake Olivier at the University of New South Wales. So I'm going to be talking about whether the National Firearms Agreement reduced the likelihood of a gun massacre in Australia. And I'm not going to do this properly. Is this one? Great. Excellent. So in early 1996, a lone gunman killed 35 people and injured 19 in the worst gun massacre in recent history in Australia. And that was in Port Arthur in Tasmania. It was the 12th massacre in Australia since 1981. It was committed with a legal firearm, and it was committed by a person who had every right to have that firearm. At the time, there was a very big media campaign. You may have remembered it if you were in Australia at the time. There was a lot of debate about gun law. There was also the political will, which was caused by a coalition of major political parties all being committed to changing the way that we legislated around guns. And that led to the National Firearms Agreement. What was quite historic about the National Firearms Agreement is every jurisdiction across Australia, every state and every territory, agreed to hand over their powers to make legislation around guns, around licensing of guns, and around the sale of guns and ammunition, to hand that over to the Commonwealth. As a result of that, we have uniform gun laws in Australia from the introduction of the NFA in 1996. So what was in the National Firearms Agreement? The first was there are changes in the reason that someone could get a gun licence. People needed now to show that they had a genuine need. Self-protection was not a genuine need to get a firearm. The disqualification of classes of people, people who had a violent conviction in the previous 5 years, people who were mentally or physically unfit to have access to a gun, to get a gun licence. The Firearms Agreement also introduced a waiting period of 28 days between the obtaining of a licence to when somebody could get a firearm. There was also a ban on many automatic, self-loading and or self-automatic firearms, including the long-arm firearm that was used in Port Arthur. There were restrictions placed around the storage of ammunition and firearms, and there was also restrictions on the type of ammunition people could get. People were only able to get ammunition for which they were licensed for the firearm that went with it. Australian gun laws went from relatively lenient and relatively inconsistent across the jurisdictions to what many considered one of the toughest across the world. The Firearms Agreement was also accompanied by a gun buyback, which went from late 1996 to September 1997. There's also been a number of buybacks in the period of time since then. The buyback in 1996-97 was the largest destruction of civilian firearms from 1991 to 2006 across the world. 640,000 guns were bought back over that period. 60,000 additional guns were handed in without compensation. This signified about a fifth of the Australian stock. At the time, obviously because of the leniency of gun laws, there was no good records of the number of guns in the Australian population. But there was a telephone survey that was carried out in 1996, and that estimated that at the time, before the buyback, there was about 3.25 million guns in Australia. The number of households with a gun went from 15% in 1992 to 8% in 2000, so about half. The gun buyback cost about $360 million, and it was paid for by a special levy which was attached to the Medicare levy on all Australian taxpayers. If we're considering the legislation and its evaluation, we have to think first, what was it setting out to do? Was it trying to reduce gun deaths, single gun deaths, single homicides, or suicides? Or was it instead, which is clear by looking at the restrictions in place, reducing the likelihood of a gun massacre? I have a quote there, which is from the Prime Minister of Australia at the time, John Howard, who was instrumental in the gun legislation. Now, I don't pretend for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, that the decision that we have taken is going to guarantee that in the future there won't be other mass murders. I don't pretend that for a moment. What I do argue to you, my friends, is that it will significantly reduce the likelihood of those occurring in the future. So has it been successful? The majority of previous studies have focused on trends in gun deaths, in homicides and suicides, both single gun deaths and multiple. There have been a mixture of results. Some studies have argued that the NFA has been a success in reducing gun deaths, and some have argued the opposite. This can be possibly attributed to differences in the methodology and in the appropriateness of methodologies used, and in the start and finish dates in the time series. Only one quantitative study to date has actually looked at the reduction in massacres, in gun massacres, using the Massacre series in Australia. That compared the Australian Massacre series with the New Zealand Massacre series. It argued that prior to 1996, the series were the same, were identical in their characteristics. And therefore, the evidence of no gun massacre in New Zealand after 1996 pointed to the fact that because there had been, when the study was done, none in Australia, that was not to be attributed to the NFA, but was in fact a characteristic of the series. Now, there are a lot of concerns with this study. The first is that the two series actually aren't the same. They don't share the same characteristics. The second is that New Zealand introduced many of those gun tightening laws that I spoke about earlier prior to 1996. So there was contamination in the New Zealand series. They introduced those in 1992 in response to a massacre within their own country. The second, another aspect of concern is that the New Zealand series contained a massacre in 1997, which is after, obviously, the introduction of our NFA. But the study counted that in the pre-period and not in the post-period. So that study concluded that there was no impact. But looking at those results and looking at the methodology, we would have concern around the validity of the conclusions. Now, because the Australian experience, because of how tough our gun laws are seen internationally, because that experience is cited so often in global debates on both sides of the debate as evidence for and against tightening gun laws, it's very important for us, really, to have a good sense of whether our gun laws have been successful. But as we can see, it is very difficult to evaluate. Now, why has this intervention been so hard to evaluate and come up with a conclusive decision over whether or not it has been successful? The first is that it is a low count time series. Massacres are a rare event. The second is that up until recently, there have been no events in the post-1996 period. I'm going to come back to that when we talk about the massacre series itself. But most of the studies that have been done prior to a massacre occurring in the post-period. This makes it difficult to determine what methodology we would use for a low count time series data with no events or few events after the intervention. There is also no comparison group. The gun laws were rolled out across the whole country at the same time, in the same way. We don't have other jurisdictions beyond Australia that are good comparison groups. New Zealand, which is often used as a comparison group for other social and political studies in Australia, is not a good comparison group in this case. So the aim of our study was to test whether the National Firearms Agreement has reduced the likelihood of a gun massacre. But we also wanted to ensure that the results held, or to determine whether results held, by looking at differences in some of the aspects that had been shown in previous studies to impact on results. The definition of a massacre, so we used different definitions. The start time in the time series, so we used different start times, and the type of methodology that was employed. So the definition of a massacre. Now, there is no definition of a gun massacre that is understood and used throughout all studies, but there are two main ones. One of them comes from the National Homicide Monitoring Program, which was used in the New Zealand comparison study that I was talking about earlier. This one states 4 or more victims, not including the gun person, the gun shooter, over a 24-hour period and a single shooter. A second study, which was done by Simon Chapman and his colleagues, used a slightly different definition, used the definition around 5 victims or more. Now, this was designed to remove a lot of domestic homicides, so to have that sort of higher threshold. Their study didn't have a limit on the time period or the number of shooters. So here's our massacre data set, and I can imagine that it's probably not the easiest thing to see, but we can see on the very far right-hand corner where I've got yes and no, and they have whether or not the massacre itself was included in that National Homicide Monitoring Program definition, so the 4 or more victims. And the column just next to it, the second column from the right, shows whether the massacre itself was included in the Chapman study, so in using the definition of 5 or more victims. You can see with that very, okay, that was the wrong button. How do I do the pointer thing now? In that very first line there is a massacre that occurred in 1971 that wasn't included in either of the studies, but we included in ours. You can also see, which I've highlighted down the bottom, the single massacre that occurred after the introduction of the NFA. And that occurred in September in 2014. So, as I was saying, we used a number of different methodologies to ensure that the results were not impacted by the methodology itself and the assumptions that underpin it. The first is Fisher's exact test, which is a non-parametric test that can be used to determine whether there is an association between two categorical variables. The second is a likelihood ratio test where we use the geometric distribution, and we use the definition of a geometric distribution being the time between events, in this case months. We also used a GLM model, so a generalized linear model, where we again used the geometric distribution, but this time we used a different definition of the geometric distribution, which was the number of failures before a success. And again, the success was a massacre, and the number of failures were the number of months without a massacre. And here are the results. So on the left-hand side, you'll see those rows have the method. So the first one is the Fisher's exact test, the second is the likelihood ratio test, and the last is the generalized linear model. Here, I have only included the results for where we use the definition of a massacre, being the NHMP, the 4 or more victims. The results, however, do not change when we change the number of victims or the number of shooters or the time period. You can see here that there are 2 columns. The first column is where we have included the massacre that occurred in 1971. In the second, we start in 1981. So we exclude that massacre that was in 1971. You can see there that the odds ratio or the relative risk is included in each of the cells, and underneath each one is the confidence interval around the odds ratio. So what do the results show? Uniformly, we can see that the odds ratio and relative risk using different methodologies, using different data sets, using different definitions of time points and massacres are all around 0.1. That's irrespective, as I've got there, of the method or the definition. And a relative risk or an odds ratio of 0.1 suggests a reduction of about 90%. We can see that our confidence intervals are wide around the point estimates. That is due, obviously, to the small number of observations, the low count data set that we've got. However, we saw that the majority of those cells, the confidence interval, upper confidence interval, was 0.5, which is still a reduction of about 50% in the likelihood. And most of those results were significant at the 10 or 5% significance level. So what conclusions can we draw? Well, the first one is obviously considering the methodology that we used. We do not have a causative relationship between our intervention and our outcome, which is the number of massacres. We have, at best, a correlative relationship. So we are showing a relationship between the two rather than one leading to the other, rather than an impact. The second is that the scarcity of data, our low count data set, suggests that results should be treated with caution. We have a small number of observations, even when we consider a very long time period starting in 1971. However, we can see that across all 3 methodologies, we see a reduction in the likelihood of a gun massacre of 90%. And we see, again, that's irrespective of definitions of the massacre and of the time period around when it was started. So there is clearly no evidence in this study to suggest that the NFA has been a failure, that it has not led to an impact on, that has not led to a consistency or the same likelihood of a gun massacre. we would argue that, I've got 5 things left to say. We would argue that irrespective of those first 2 points, there is still very strong evidence here. Although we have to treat it with caution, there is very strong evidence and consistent evidence to suggest that the NFA did lead to a significant reduction, a reduction in the vicinity of about 90% in the likelihood of a gun massacre in Australia.
Thanks, Lucy. Stay up here for 5 minutes of questions, starting with Don.
So I've got one for you. I might have missed the point, but if mass shootings or mass murders are a random subset of murders and they were coming down beforehand, how does your technique, I mean, normally an interrupted time series would take the preceding trend into account. How does your method deal with that problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think while it is a subset, it's a very small subset of the bigger gun death data set. And actually, when you look at, and it probably comes out a little bit better when you see the graph of the massacres. There's only, altogether, I think there's only 15 of them across the whole period. And they don't reflect, there's no decreasing trend in massacres themselves. And in fact, there is some evidence of clustering, and that's something that has been put, that the gun massacres are, at risk of being copycat. There is a copycat effect in gun massacres, which again, you'd need to be very careful around how you're controlling. There's not a particular evidence of that in the Australian massacre series. Again, it is a very small series, so it is very difficult to work out trends overall. But there isn't, even though it is, as you're saying, the gun deaths have been decreasing, because it is such a small, a very tiny subset of overall gun deaths, there's not that trend in the massacre series.
Right, there's probably, I've got another question, but there's probably others.
There's one down the back, actually. Thank you. Right down the back.
Hi, I have a microphone, thank you. I'm interested in the correlative relationship between what you're talking about and the NFA. I was just wondering if you could confirm for me, who actually does enact Australian firearms laws?
So, I mean, as I understand it, after the introduction of the NFA, it was that power was given to the federal government.
That's actually incorrect. So the states and jurisdictions in Australia enact their own firearms laws. They have always done.
Okay.
And the result of that is that those firearms laws are consistently updated and reviewed over time.
Okay.
So what was enacted in 1996 is not the same as does exist now. And the third comment I would make is that the number of people who are murdered in homicides that use firearms over time appears to be diminishing. Is that something that you discovered in your analysis of the data?
So that was something that Don, I think, was just talking about then, and that, I mean, that obviously comes out in the bigger gun death series, which is, as Don was saying then, in New South Wales is coming down, but in the massacre series, which is obviously a tiny proportion of that, there isn't in the time series that leading up to the NFA, and obviously after the NFA, it's a very different time series because there is only that single event. There's no suggestion that it was going down over time.
Did you come across any other significant variables that might have impacted from 1996 onwards?
Yeah, so that's something that through some of the models that were done where they were looking at gun deaths themselves, and so they looked at that bigger series, they were able to bring in additional variables. The study that I was talking about that looked at the comparison between Australia and New Zealand, they actually brought in they brought the variable into the model about whether it was a public or a private, so a public space or a domestic murder. But by doing that, you obviously significantly reduce the power of these models to detect that. You'll also notice that 2 of my methods were not, you wouldn't have been able to bring in additional variables through that. The Fisher's exact test and the likelihood ratio test, you aren't able to bring in additional variables. You could have done that through the GLM, the generalised linear model, but when you're talking about such few observations, you would have then lost all of your statistical power to determine that. So that is, as I'm saying, I'm very upfront about the fact that the scarcity of data makes this a very, very difficult thing to evaluate. It makes it a very, very difficult thing to draw conclusions from, substantial, significant, the kind of conclusions that we're used to drawing. And that's why it's a very difficult to, that's why, most studies obviously don't look at this, because it is such a difficult thing to look at. And you have so many caveats we can't look at as you would want to. We can't look at where the massacre occurred. We can't look at other aspects that we would want to because of the small number of observations.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but it just seems so incredibly convenient and perfect, the outcome. It makes me longing to see whether mental health policy or something changed significantly around those times. But
Sure.
again, with such a small
Sure.
number, thankfully.
Yeah.
I
And
don't
that's why, yes, I mean, you'd never want to say, and you can't say, that has been entirely due, it's been due to the introduction of the NFA. You can't draw that causative link. What you can instead say is that there's a relationship between the 2 of them.
Okay, I think we can have one more to finish off. Thanks.
Okay, sorry, Lucy. I just had a thought for a study.
Great.
You know, the problem with the homicide data is that other factors affect homicide than being shot, like how good the emergency medical facilities are. That might determine whether you end up dead or not.
Yeah.
So my thought was, why, not this sort of study, but why not do an interrupted time series analysis where you look at the number of people shot, not the number of people who died? Presumably you'd get a clear effect. You'd have lots of data, you'd have a better signal to noise ratio, you'd have a better chance of finding out whether or not the National Firearms Agreement or the buyback had any effect on it. I know you're working in education, but you're so good at this stuff, why not, throw in another, this could be a PhD.
Sure. But what I'd also like to say there, though, is that, yes, using the bigger gun deaths data set makes all of these things that we would want to do easier to do, because it is a bigger data set, we have more data around. But we do come back to why was the NFA introduced and what was the motivation behind the legislation. And it wasn't about reducing gun deaths per se. I mean, obviously that is a subset of that, but it was really designed around the reduction in the likelihood of somebody doing what happened in Port Arthur, which is where I think the NFA should be evaluated and should be looked at, is that reduction in its original purpose.
You can ask any question you like. That's what John Howard wanted.
Sure.
And we can do so at Siren Bar afterwards. Cocktails, mocktails, bring your own wallet, or just come for conversation. Thank you to the 3 presenters and for your contributions today, for all your questions. And we'll see you either later on or tomorrow. Thank you.